Protocols in Process and Practice. I'd like to thank our industry series sponsors, CBC and CBC Docs. And thank you again to the Canada Media Fund as well for supporting this industry series discussion. In an accompanying dialogue from our previous panel, we take considerations and challenges of implementing a new Protocols and Pathways production guide for Canada. Imaginative's board chair, Marcia Nickerson, sits down with Penny Smallcombe of Screen Australia to understand the practicalities and benefits that have come from nearly a decade of Protocols and Pathways implementation. And we learned from Michelle Van Buskam of the National Film Board of Canada and filmmaker Zoe Hopkins of case studies and production experiences in Canada at the moment that will inform our guide for content creators for the future. Our moderator for the discussion is Marcia Nickerson, so thank you, Marcia, and to all of our panelists, and thank you for giving me time to this important discussion. Marcia is a leader in the field of Indigenous governance, providing high-level advisory services to Indigenous, federal, and provincial governments, Indigenous organizations, and other public sector clients. Nickerson is currently an independent consultant and has been the chair of the Imaginative Film and Media Arts Festival for the past 7 years. Really, wow, we love you. I'm going to cry. Most recently, she worked with several industry partners and the Indigenous content creators to help create an Indigenous screen office, and we're so excited to see that future come to life. Thank you, Marcia, for moderating, and for Penny, Michelle, and Zoe for participating today. And I'll leave it to Marcia. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So, as I think's been said by Daniel much earlier this morning, far before coffee and before the previous panel, Imaginative, is really dedicated to having these discussions and continuing these conversations and being really proactive for the Indigenous filmmaking community and trying to address some of the things that you heard on the previous panel. And a part of that is the on-screen Protocols and Pathways, which is a media production guide to working with First Nation communities, for Métis communities and Inuit communities and cultures that we announced in May at Hot Docs, so you may know that. But really to start addressing the import, prevalence, and persistence of the issues that were so well articulated earlier. And the project, I have to say, Daniel and Jason and Imaginative's staff had to really worked for 2 years just to get the funding in place to do this, worked really hard to convince funders why it was necessary to have this type of protocol and guideline. And thankfully, we are being funded by the Ontario Media Development Corporation, the National Film Board of Canada, the Canada Media Fund, In Spirit Foundation, Telefilm Canada, and Creative BC. So we've done the research stage of the project, and we're moving into the 18-month consultation, packaging, and dissemination stage of the project. And right now are seeking a team and a leader to head that project, and there are calls out for that you can find on our website and that we can talk to you about. There's postings under the Institute button on the Imaginative website. And so once those positions are filled, we're going to move forward with developing, finally, these protocols and pathways. So I don't think I need to tell you why it needs to be done, but just in case you missed some of the discussion this morning, these protocols and pathways are really about, addressing the perpetuation of the damage of stereotypes and how they actually impact physically and mentally on communities. How these are not just stereotypes that exist out in the ether but these are actually things that have consequences for individuals in our communities. And these are things that these stereotypes and these portrayals that we've been talking about actually just perpetuate the colonial paradigm, and both within the industry and within communities. So we want to move from that, and I'm putting this together, but that mined and extracted paradigm that Indigenous creators have been subject to, towards a more collaborative and safe process for topics, communities, and individuals. And so for us, the protocols and pathways are going to sort of articulate your responsibilities, your relationships, and what the appropriate processes are to ensure that this dynamic changes. So building on what happened this morning, we have with us today Penny Smallcombe she's the head of the Indigenous at Screen Australia. She's also, Penny is a producer. She's been a senior programmer for NITV, which is the National Indigenous Television division in Australia. She has been working on this and working with these protocols because they have them already in Australia. Australia is one of the only examples that we have of where these kinds of protocols and pathways have been put in place. So we have Penny here to speak to the experiences of what that means when it's unfolding and it's implemented. Beside her, we have Zoe Hopkins, director and producer, who is from Bella and who now lives in Six Nations, and who, as a filmmaker, has been in the Sundance Institute feature film program, who's screened all over the world at Sundance, Berlinale, Imaginative, and who is going to talk about her recent experience with her feature film and these types of issues and how they've played out for her. And at the end of the table here, we have Michelle Van Busen, who's the executive director of the English language production at the NFB, National Film Board. And she leads the creative direction, operations, and financing for 5 production studios, which work with emerging mid-career and established directors across the country. And currently, she's also the co-lead on the initiative, that NSB initiative we were talking about earlier, that was recently announced, the Indigenous Equity Plan. So how these protocols and pathways at an institutional level can serve production at that level as well. So that's our panelists. That's sort of you've got the overview for our discussion. I really want to, if I can, we want to come away from some of this discussion of an understanding of the complexities that we're going to be facing as we move into this 18-month consultation process, and some of the issues that we're going to be facing and some of the things that we're going to need to be addressing. And I'd like to start with Penny, and Penny, first maybe you can talk about how the protocols came to being 20 years ago? 2009. Oh, it was the Indigenous Screen Office that was in place 20 years ago. But 2009, how and why the protocols came in place in Australia?
So the Pathways and Protocol Guide, as I said, was established in 2009. Leading up to that, I think there was about 5 years worth of research and consultation around the country by Terry Janke, who is a very well-known Indigenous lawyer whose expertise is in ICIP. So it established basically because for a very long period of time, as you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are very well documented. Some would say that we are probably the most documented group of people in the world. And I think it was probably up until 20 years ago, the vast majority of content, film content, screen content, radio content, or media content was made by non-Indigenous filmmakers. In the 70s was the beginning of a new period of collaboration between non-Indigenous filmmakers and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander documentary filmmakers. And it was that early period, of course, as you know, if everyone's seen Jeddah and all those other early films, you would well know the way that we've been portrayed in the past has been just awful, racist, and completely incorrect. So, with that history in mind, the protocols came about because I think there was a realisation that you can't stop non-Indigenous filmmakers from making content about us. My predecessors had 2 different opinions about that. Sally Riley always said they're going to make content regardless. So I think that we need to provide some information about how they can do it properly. Erica Glynn, on the other hand, said, Jesus Christ, did we just give them a roadmap of how to actually go out and start making stories about us? I sort of sit somewhere in the middle of that. There's no stopping non-Indigenous filmmakers. They are going to make content about us. We try and frame the conversation about collaborating with us. The protocols, at the very start of the protocol guide, the first question that is asked of filmmakers is, why you? Why are you going to tell this story? Why is it important that, who are you to tell this story? And that's the very first question. Whether our non-Indigenous filmmakers address that, and whether they think about that, and whether they consider that, these are guidelines, we don't police that. But certainly, those questions are asked up front. Then if they continue on the journey of making the documentary, the feature film, there's a very practical guide to your development process, how you collaborate, how you find liaisons to shoot appropriately, how in your post-production process you should be bringing back, if you're making a documentary, they should be a part of that post-production process. There's very clear guidelines in relation to those things. Do they work? I don't know. I don't know. At Screen Australia, a big part of my job is looking at, so we fund, to apply for funds to my department, you must be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander writer or director. But in the mainstream areas, non-Indigenous filmmakers can apply for funds to make whatever films they want. If the script has Indigenous content, it comes to my department to look through. I do Indigenous notes about, the character is, completely stereotypical, and there's issues around this. We make recommendations that they need to follow up on. Do they? Not always. A lot of people see protocols as an obstacle, an infringement on their rights to tell stories. However, they're very important, and there are really good case studies of people that have used the protocol guide effectively. They've made a better film, they have collaborated with Indigenous people, and there is a more authentic documentary or feature film because of that. So I think that you do need to have the protocols as it starts the conversation, which is, I think, the most important part of them.
And we talked about, we've been talking about what some of those practical examples are of how they've been used and how that changes story and decision making. And I'm just wondering if you can maybe just give a couple examples or one or two examples of how it's changing and how it's a learning tool for those productions.
Actually, so probably a really positive case study that a lot of people talk about is Rolf de Heer's 10 Canoes. So Rolf is a long-time collaborator with David Gopal. They had made The Tracker before, and David had said to Rolf, I want to make a film on my country, where I come from, just outside of Ramingining in the Northern Territory. It's a very remote community. And Rolf said, well, I think I've got an idea for a story. So Rolf went to Ramingining. They sat down for a while. Rolf talked about what he wanted to make, and David pretty much turned around and said, no, I think that's a crap idea. Let me talk to the community and I'll come back to you. So Rolf sitting in Ramingining, sort of a month goes past, second month goes past. By the third month, Rolf is like, well, I don't think this is going to happen. We haven't started to write, I haven't even seen David. And then Rolf's about to pack up and go home. Then David comes out and says, it's on, we're doing it. Rolf goes, what are we doing? And he goes, I've got people this day to make canoes. And Rolf's like, oh, okay. And there the story evolved. So David was spending that entire 3 months going out and doing that development in Ramingining, finding out a story that the community wanted to tell, and then came back, and that is the way collaboration could happen. Rolf certainly had an idea of the story he wanted to tell, but David came back with a much better story, a more authentic story, and that's really been a fantastic collaboration. And that's a big part of it. It's about, if you want to engage in Indigenous storytelling, from the concept, From the very concept, you have to be collaborating. You must be talking with Indigenous people. If you go in and have already a preconceived notion of the story that you want to tell, you're on the wrong path straight away.
Maybe one more thing before we go on. I'm just wondering how, because in the 2 years we've been trying to develop the ability to do this project, we've been had discussions of how is this going to be policed? You know, because I've heard these stories of non-Indigenous producers who've heard that this is coming in the works, and it's the immediate thing is, you know, is this going to impact our funding? Do we have to do that? We actually have no way right now of ensuring, you know, we can create these protocols and we can distribute these protocols and encourage these protocols, but we have no power to ensure that they are used. I'm just wondering, and my impression and my discussions with people from Screen Australia was that if you're getting funding from Screen Australia, you have to follow these protocols because it's public funding and this is it. So, but us at Imaginative, and we don't intend on owning these protocols moving forward. We're just we're just doing this first stage of development. But how do we police them? How do we? And is that true though? If you're getting that funding, you have to follow these protocols and processes, and then, but that's because it's within an institutional setting. And I'm just wondering if you wanted to say anything about how the industry, the mainstream industry, is being briefed.
Look, there are guidelines. There's no way of policing them. I won't lie, sometimes they are very much what feels like a bit of a tick-the-box exercise. If you are not Indigenous and you apply to Screen Australia, as I said, you have Indigenous content, themes or characters, you have to write a consultation statement, which is a part of your application. So we can always feed back on that. We do basic things like looking at their budget, and they say they're going to bring on a consultant, and there's no budget line item for a consultant. So, you know, we can push those kind of things back. So we certainly have the ability to be able to push back on non-Indigenous producers and remind them of their obligations. You know, Australian producers are not evil people. They often are a little bit ignorant and need to be guided, and that's certainly a part of the process that we do. If the content or if the script or the idea comes through and it's highly problematic, to some degree we do have some power to be able to say, look, we're not going to fund this unless this and this and this happens. But then what happens is, of course, they go off into production and, you know, what is made is made. Often I get pulled in to be at rough cuts for films that are highly problematic, to give some information back, you know, to talk about, you know, where they can change it, which is very annoying. By then I feel like telling you to go get fucked. It's way too fucking late. Am I sitting in here and why are there clapsticks and what's this dance scene about? You know, there was a film, I was trying to think, Around the Block, you know. There's a film where the Indigenous character, played by Hunter Page, steals something, runs off, suddenly he's on top of a beachfront cliff doing a dance and like putting over anything. It's like, why would he be doing that if he just ran away? And why is he being represented as a thief? Here we go again. We can certainly oversee things to some extent. We are there to remind them of their obligations. We are there to remind them that if they want to make an authentic piece of work, they need to collaborate. We are rewriting our guidelines right now. We're taking out the word consultation and putting in collaboration. There are lots of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander filmmakers that, you know, sort of say, Penny, do not give my name anymore. I'm not going to read another non-Indigenous person's script. And they're going to give me some shit $1,500 consultancy fee. I'm not going to get any real credits. They actually should be given a script editor credit. You know, if you've got an Indigenous consultant on the ground because you're shooting on someone else's country, they shouldn't just be consultant. They're actually, you know, they're a unit manager. people should be given real credits for the work they do on these productions. But, you know, we're reframing the conversation, and we're going to say that, and we are saying that if you want to make these films, you better go off and you better find yourself an Indigenous director. You better co-write the script. You better, you know, do these things properly. You better give people their real credits and better pay people properly. And people need to be a part of the recoupment plan for funds that come back through. You know, so we push as best we can, but we're also at the I think Aboriginal Australian and Torres Strait Islander filmmakers are at the detriment of their own success right now. People have realised that actually you can actually make money out of Australian films about Indigenous people. They do very well outside of Australia. In Australia, no one wants to watch them, but outside they do really well. So we actually are at a point where I'm seeing a huge increase in the amount of feature film scripts coming through with Indigenous characters' themes. So it's probably a third of my job is overseeing these. I get very resentful about having to do that, because my time should be placed working with Indigenous filmmakers to tell their own stories. But, you know, we are there, we're overseeing it, and the good producers and the good filmmakers will collaborate and do it properly, and the guidelines are there to assist them. And they are important, and I'm glad they've been written, and they will continue to evolve as well. We'll continue to rewrite them. Things change. We're adding right now a whole new section about VR. You know, it's a totally different technology. You know, there's certain areas in Australia that are very secret and sacred and can't be shot. So when people are doing drone work with VRs, it's like, how do you manage that appropriately? You've got to bring the filmmakers back in at the end of production because you don't know what the drone imagery has picked up. So there's all these new elements with the changing of technology. As you would also know, the deceased people's warning in the front of a lot of our films is very important. What's that going to mean for in the VR world when someone passes away? Because it's such a technology where you're really immersed. What does that mean culturally for Indigenous people where, you know, showing images of Indigenous people is highly problematic? And a VR work where it's so immersive is going to be, you know, very difficult for Indigenous people. And also I think the last thing that's really important to know is at the end of our guidelines is the follow-up. Where is this being archived? Can this material be accessed by Indigenous people that this film has been made about? A lot of people in communities are like, yeah, someone came along and made this doco about me. I never saw it. They never told me when it went to air. And then, you know, I think they got some footage of my auntie, and I wouldn't mind seeing that. Where do you think I can get that? You know, the filmmaker comes in, goes straight out. So the protocols address those sorts of things about follow-up considerations and making sure people have access to materials that have been made about them.
Thanks, Penny. Zoe, I'd like to move to you so that you can talk about, you know, your hands-on experience in using protocols that may not be written down, but that you know and that you've experienced in your latest feature. Because as we know, in Canada, we have, you know, several languages that Indigenous languages, Indigenous cultures that we're talking about. So it's and you've kind of had to go in that process and deal with that. And I'm just wondering if you want to speak to what, because as I said earlier, these protocols and pathways are not just for non-Indigenous creators, because we ourselves, when we go into different territories in this country or are dealing with different cultures within our own country, we're hoping that, I'd imagine, that these can also be used for Indigenous filmmakers. So I'm just hoping you can share some of your experiences.
What kuna waradon isn't necessarily at the role on imaginative. Thanks to the Leaders Imaginative for having me here. I'm very happy to be here. I live in Six Nations, which is my paternal family's community, and I come from Bella Bella, where I was born. I'm happy Bella Bella's in the house. Somebody who has been a very inspirational figure in terms of protocol in general. I think your middle name might be Protocol. Frank Brown, who is here in the front row. And I'm happy, very honored to see you here as well, Tony. But somebody else who I learned a lot from as a young person coming up in the industry is Dana Claxton, who's sitting back there, who really taught me a lot about taking one's space, you know, and in making a work with non-Indigenous people, and you know, that was maybe 20 years ago, you know, watching the way that you worked on it and claiming the space and how a piece should be created. So I just want to thank you that I was really lucky. I realize now, having been given beautiful opportunities to learn and grow on set by my own people. So I think that that's changed how I work and frame all of my work. To know that, you know, this is my agency and I'm going to make the film that I want to make. So most recently, I've made 2 films, and they're both showing at the festival. I have a feature film showing on Friday evening. I hope you can come. It's called Kayak to Klemtu, and a short virtual reality documentary that's showing in the Artcade. I believe you can go anytime during the festival, kind of all day, and watch the film in full VR in the headset. And those are both set on the West Coast, specifically in and around Bella Bella. And I've made many films in Six Nations, and a lot of Mohawk language films there as well. And in Kayak to Klemtu, we filmed in many First Nations communities all along the coast. Bella Bella was the only one, obviously that's my own, where I had many connections and many people I could call upon I knew that it would be sort of an easy pathway for me to seek and attain permission to film there, and that people knew me and trusted me. One of the filming locations belongs to Frank Brown, and I was able to text his wife and say, hey, can I film on your property? And she said, yeah, go ahead. So that was a very easy access. But in terms of the other communities, and Bella Bella is a place that has an established committee that works with film companies, and it's in the heart of the Great Barrier Rainforest. So a lot of film companies come through there to make documentaries about this, you know, all the area. So they have actually a process in place where you need to apply, and there's a meeting, and your production is approved or not. Not every community has such a process because they're not as visited in terms of film production. But Bella Bella is very much visited, and just prior to going there, one of the band counselors posted this awesome post on Facebook about how tired she was of dealing with people who come in and you know, don't pay people for all of the labor that they perform to enable this production to happen. And you know, there was all these things like if you know, you need to make time, you know, and you need to have a budget for the amount of work that you're going to be using the local people for. You know, and time is a different thing in a small community like this. So it's not, you know, and time is a different thing in a film production, you know, so it's the 2 opposite ends of the scale of what time is, you know, and so there needs to be some meeting in between. And I'm very lucky to come from there, so I understand both concepts of time. Daniel Code here is one of the co-producers of my film, and I think he probably learned a lot about like protocol in terms of how to work with all of the communities and who to talk to, and how to seek out permission for different places. So the first place that we filmed in was Tla'am in Lund area in BC, the one I wanted to make sure that we had. They didn't have a process in place for film productions and whatnot. So we were able to meet with the chief and a couple of members of their elected council, and one of them is also a hereditary chief, and we just had dinner, and I bought a kayak journey, so I borrowed from the canoe culture, and after our dinner and meeting, I asked for permission to come ashore and make this film. And that's something that is from canoe culture, where you come into a community, you're in your canoe, and you ask permission to come ashore and come into this community. And we were given the blessing to come in and make the bulk of our film in this territory, in Tla'amin territory. And from there, it was just finding the people who would help us to get that access to that permission. And luckily, with my connections with all of the coastal people, through various people I know from Bella Bella, that was not very hard to do. But and in Six Nations, where I live now, there's also no process in place for filmmakers to come in. And but it's kind of a bit of a different ballgame there, because it's one of the few communities where the council allows you, or has a deal in place where you can own and manage your own land. So I have had many productions come and visit my property to make a film, because a filmmaker would only ever have to deal with me personally. I can say, like, yes, you can film on my property. As long as it's on my property only, then you're okay. You know, unless you, so you don't have to go outside and seek other permission, because that's my I can do what the hell I want there. It's a bit of a lawless land. So it's been interesting to see just the different levels of experience that communities have in dealing with film crews. And a lot of them haven't been burnt out, you know, by film crews who come in and use and abuse and make a big fucking mess and leave, you know, and never return. So it was really important to me to want to make sure that, like, to impress upon the producers, like, no, we need to make sure that every single person who was in a scene where there was 100 people in the background, we need to make sure that every single one of those people is paid. And we can't make a mistake on that, you know, because I need to go back to my home community forever. And it can't be known that, you know, if one person didn't get paid, it would get out that Zoe doesn't pay, you know, don't work for her. Or so, you know, your name is going to be mud. But if you're the kind of person who doesn't ever need to go back to that community, then what you've just done is sullied, you know, film production as a whole for that particular community. And working with that community is going to be harder for every filmmaker after that. So these protocols are very important. I can't wait for this document to come out so that the next time a non-Indigenous filmmaker approaches me to ask me, hey, you're Native, maybe you want to work on this Native story for not very much money. Then I can just say, you know, email them this document and say, read this. If you still want to work with me after you've read it and you've, you know, come up with a proper budget to do so, then call me back. But until then, I don't even have to talk to you anymore. You can just read this and thanks very much. So I don't know if there's anything more specific that you wanted to know about.
No, and I'm glad you brought up the point actually about community capacity and whether or not they have processes in place or would even begin to know how to do that, because part of this is also for communities. So, and looking at some case studies where that exists and being able to, you know, put together templates or resources for communities just to be able to adapt for themselves. And so thanks for mentioning that as well.
Oh, when you're talking about this being a document for us as Indigenous filmmakers as well, I think that's a really cool thing to note. Because I live somewhere where I can say yes or no, you can make a film on my property. I've had a number of filmmakers ask me, you know, and we all know each other, and it's been lovely, and, you know, whatnot. But it would be, you know, probably helpful sometimes to know, like, yeah, but I don't want you to make like a big, you know, killing Moody on my property. I don't want you to, just to have that sort of something in place that where I don't have to do that work for somebody who might be my friend, So it's a little bit of a two-way street. I really like that would be something in place for both sort of sides of the maker and the community.
What's the time? Yeah, okay, so we may come back to this, but before we lose time, I just want to also talk to Michelle a bit about, especially particularly because NFB's documentary viewpoint, and how as an institution you're working to implement changes in learning and new productions, and what pathways that you have for developing some checks and balances moving forward.
So this whole topic of protocols and pathways is something that we're very interested in. I first read the Screen Australia protocols, I guess about 18 months ago, and that came out of a conversation with Daniel. Closer? Is that better? So I guess about 18 months ago I was talking to Daniel, and he told me about the Screen Australia protocols document and about Imaginative starting to build this momentum towards creating protocols for the Canadian screen industry. And I said, it's a fantastic idea, and I read the Screen Australia guidelines, and that got me starting to think about, okay, Imaginative is spearheading screen protocols, but for the broader industry, and it's aimed at both non-Indigenous and Indigenous filmmakers, producers, but it's television, it's feature film, it's the full gamut, it's the commercial gamut. And at the Film Board, we have mainly a non-commercial mandate. We're very niche. We're focused on documentary, auteur animation, interactive, immersive VR projects. So we felt that there was something complementary that we could be doing that was principally documentary focused, but also animation and the more experimental, immersive VR. And so how can we be working in tandem with Imaginative in a parallel process and develop protocols that would apply to anyone working with the Film Board. At the same time, really acknowledging that at the Film Board we're undergoing a process of making some changes in our organization to really promote Indigenous equity at all levels, from who works in our organization. For example, we've made a commitment to achieving representational parity in our workforce. At the moment, we're 400 full-time employees. Only 2 people self-identify as Indigenous. One is 85 years old. That's shameful. It should be 16 to be representative. And so we're putting into place recruitment and retention strategies, working closely with APTN to learn from their experiences, and so we want that from the board of trustees level, senior management, producers, executive producers, maybe the next person in my job, distribution, marketing, like human resources, all areas of the organization, because that's going to be the foundation for real change. And I just should mention Marcia was a huge part of this process that we've been doing. Thank you, Marcia. I've learned so much from you. And then in terms of protocols and practices, so we've also made a commitment that 15% of our production funds are going to be dedicated to work with Indigenous filmmakers. And that's much more than representational parity, but the reason for that is for all the reasons that were discussed today. There's so many stories that were not told because of colonialism, because of the Indian Act, because so many cultural practices were illegal until 1951. There is so much ground to recuperate. So we want to stake that ground within the Film Board and create that space. But what that means is that the majority of projects on Indigenous subjects that are being made at the Film Board are being made by Indigenous filmmakers. So there will be very few that are not, but first, we need to attain that 15, and that's a floor. It's not a ceiling. So, but we're looking at, like what you were talking about, Zoe, access to communities, and I'll give you an example. My colleague Shirley, who's in the room, is working on a project called The Whale and the Raven. It's a co-production. It's a film that's about 2 whale researchers. They're non-Indigenous, but they're working on Indigenous lands in the Gitga'at Nation in the Pacific West Coast, northern Pacific West Coast of BC. It's not an Indigenous story, but it does have some Indigenous elements because, of course, these researchers are working on Indigenous territories. And, one of the first times we met with the filmmakers, we said, hey, do you know about the Screen Australia protocols? We don't have anything like that, but we'd like to have something like that sent back. They looked at that. The GitGAD is an example of a community that does have established processes and protocols in place. And so they led on putting together an agreement with the co-producers, which is awesome in terms of its best practices. So it had protocols around where you can shoot and where you can't shoot in sacred territories and just mapping all of that out super clearly about employment opportunities. What kind of employment opportunities might this production bring, and prioritizing people from the community for those opportunities. Creating a workshop for youth who might be interested in learning more about filmmaking, taking advantage of having that crew in the community to create that kind of opportunity, leaving archives behind, doing some additional shooting that would be of benefit to the community and leaving that behind. And when I've read some of the things that have been done in Australia, it felt like it was really hitting so many of these best practices. So I got excited about that, and with the permission of the GitGAD, I've shared that with Imaginative as well. So see this as a great opportunity for just kind of sharing and learning from what each other is doing. Tasha mentioned in the initial conversation that happened between us and a group of filmmakers, but also people working in distribution and broadcasting and education, libraries, archives, all the areas where the Film Board is active. And Tasha spoke to us about a situation she's encountered, and I think many Indigenous filmmakers have encountered, where you're directing a film, but most of your crew is non-Indigenous. And people feel like they're having to do an awful lot of educating, and it can become very draining, and it can become very fraught because people are behaving inappropriately and they don't even know they're behaving appropriately. So what can you put into place to deal with that? So my colleague David here is working with Maya Tailfeathers on a project that's being shot in her community, the Blood Reserve in Alberta. And there was a development shoot and ran into some of those issues. And so together with Maya, developed a process for some cultural competency training for the crew, and made that really specific to the community. If you want more details, I could pass the mic to David to give those. But for now, really approaching it case by case, and then the next step would be to look at what can be distilled from that and can then be kind of shared out as a best practice, because we're realizing that it's so specific, like what's happening on this Whale of the Raven project compared with what's happening on Dust Settles, or my colleague Alicia here is working on another project in Shoal Lake 40. It's similar, but it's always different. So that's kind of where we're at in our process.
I just had a couple other concrete examples I wanted to talk about. You mentioned about non-Indigenous crew. I remember making a film maybe 10 years ago in Bella Bella, and having to run outside and tell the guys that they can't in fact be wrapping out the gear and packing up the equipment again and having a beer, and drinking outside the back of the truck, which is kind of a thing. You wrap out your stuff, you have a beer with the guys. My mom saw them out the window. She's like, they're drinking. And so I had to run outside and be like, guys, we just, can't do that, And now, I was fortunate enough to know enough people to billet out 28 people in this community that doesn't have a hotel, and ask the producers to explain, okay, you can't go to the bar and come home drunk. This is not an Airbnb. We're billeted at people's homes, so just be respectful. And just an added layer of trying to tell people you have to raise your bar of respect a little higher. This isn't Toronto. Wherever you go, you're not in Toronto, you're not in Vancouver, and you can't behave like a crew. You have to behave like a respectful individual. And there was one other one, but I forget. I'll
I'd like to ask Penny to speak to one more because, we want to give some positive examples of how this has played out in Australia, and I think there's one that's kind of fun to talk about.
Yeah, sorry, I probably do come across sounding very pessimistic about the guidelines. I don't mean to. It's probably just because I can think of more negative examples than I can positive, which might be because the positive, I don't hear about the positive stories because they just happen and those films get made and they work. And I have to do a lot with the negative ones. But Master has asked for a positive example for a change. No, I was just it's like simple things. Taika came to the Gold Coast to shoot Thor. The film has no Indigenous themes, culturally specific characters. But the beauty of Taika was that he came, he contacted Pauline Clegg, Pauline contacted me, and Taika said, look, if I'm going to make this film in Australia, I want to be surrounded by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So we were able to work together to help fund 8 internships on the film. As you know, there's Hollywood blockbusters. That's an amazing opportunity for our filmmakers. But not only did we do and fund 8 internships, he employed, I think it was about 30 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to drivers, unit managers, all these different areas. And the first day of shoot, they did a welcome to country. They got a local community person to do a welcome to country. And that is, a beautiful example of, doing things respectfully on somebody else's country. And that's an example of the layers of it as well. And, the point is, and I think that we were talking about it, there's no one way to get it right. There are so many ways to skin a cat, and there are so many ways to approach, the practice of storytelling. The protocols, an important part of the protocols are that people look and think about, okay, how do I begin this properly? It must be done from the concept. You shouldn't even have a concept if you're not Indigenous. You shouldn't have I want to make this love story about 2 Indigenous people, and that shouldn't even be your story. It should be like, well, I feel impassioned and I feel like I want to work with Indigenous people and I feel, I want to do something right. Well, actually, you can just fuck off and go make your own story. But if they are so inclined to do it, from the very beginning, they actually need to find Indigenous people to collaborate. We're not scary. Filmmaking is a team sport. We're very well aware of that. We do like to collaborate. We're complex storytellers. So, it's about that process, about doing it properly. The guidelines are nothing to fear. I must also say that we're not the only agency that has protocols. The ABC, our broadcaster, has Indigenous protocols, and so does SBS. So the broadcasters have protocols very similar to ours. Ours are actually based off original ones that Darlene Johnson wrote for SBS. So it's not just ours, and then local communities often have their own protocols as well. So there's many layers to this. They're nothing to fear, and they certainly, they are extremely helpful. And have a look at the Screen Australia guidelines. There's checklists, pre-production, post. It's spelt out very clearly about all the things that need to be thought about. And, I'm surprised that you don't already have them in existence.
Just because we're at time, and I want to make sure, Zoe, if you remembered what you wanted to say, or Michelle, if you had anything that you wanted to add to this before we close out. Otherwise, I'm very happy to end on the note of don't be afraid, because when that's the starting point, when we haven't even begun to develop these yet, and it's a ridiculous place to start from, and it should be, as you said, starting from one of collaboration, respect, responsibility. But is there anything else that you would like to add about that?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to add one piece when I was talking about the example of the cultural competency training we've done for crew, that of course begs the question, well, why isn't the crew Indigenous, right? And I think different studies that have been done have pointed out that in Canada there's real gaps in terms of producers, in terms of cinematographers, sound people, composers, editors. So there's a real need within the industry to create those opportunities, and that's something that we're trying to do as well. So on the Dust Settles, for example, there is an Indigenous cinematographer who's working with the lead cinematographer. There are going to be certain scenes where he's taking the full lead, so he's not always kind of B camera and following the lead of the A1 and building up those opportunities. So I was really happy to hear about the database that the Imaginative Institute is starting, where we can, also share out so people know that those opportunities are available. But that's the kind of thing that has to start industry-wide, right? Like we have to build those mechanisms for people to get those opportunities so that we can build up people in the craft positions.
On my feature film, we achieved gender parity in front of and behind the camera. Half the cast was Indigenous, half the crew was Indigenous. It's not that hard. I also wanted to add about, I just remembered Nyla sitting there. There was something you said about the virtual reality machine and how much ground you can cover, and an early conversation. Nyla is the VR producer for a documentary I made called Impossible to Contain. And I'm very new to VR, it was my first piece, but Nyla had a good conversation with me about how VR can be, how there's this weird relationship between sympathy and empathy, and how this machine is created and how you need to just be really aware of that, and so I used VR for this medium to show people what a diesel spill did to my community, and we're 1 year out from a tugboat spilling 100,000 liters of diesel in my people's main food source in our territory. And so I wanted to use that medium so I could put people on the ground and so they could see what happened, looking at the diesel in the water. So for me that relationship was really set in the medium, and so I think that the medium also has to be considered. That was a pathway to a protocol that I had a conversation, and I think everything circles back to the panel that happened prior to this one, where if you have an Indigenous creator at the helm, you'll be okay, and one last little example was a use of a traditional song in my feature film, seeking out the traditional owner of that song and asking him, for the use of it, and then trying to, like our composer is getting paid a healthy fee to compose the music for this film, so I wanted to make sure our traditional music gets a, that we pay, but he said, no, this is a song that is there, and my son is the traditional owner of this song, and this song is meant to be shared with the people, and it would not be right to receive a pay for that. So just credit the traditional owner of the song, that's my little boy, and he speaks for his little boy. But I, as the author of this film, you carry such a great responsibility to your people when you make a film in your territory about your people. And the biggest thing I want to do is make them proud, and it's a lot of responsibility, So this document, or this protocol, I hope will help people understand just the weight that you carry, that is a load that you carry. You're not just making a film, but you have a responsibility for a lifetime to that community. And so, you have to do little things, like I will now make a donation to the children's camp, where they go to learn about our songs and culture and stuff, and that's my personal commitment to my responsibility to the story that I carry, and it's put back on me as the creator of this project. and it's no longer associated with the film. And I really hope that there's never going to be a release form or a document with regards to that song, because I really hope that his word will stand. And I want to. That'll be my last fight for this film, is for there to be no document about that song. And I know that'll be a little fight, because the industry doesn't want to hear about that. They want to make sure their legal ass is covered. But I think that'll be my proud last fight, to say no, we have to let this word stand.
Yeah, I think the previous panel conversation was very much in line with the conversations that we had in Australia, absolutely. And I think that, it's just important to remember, making a film is almost like building a house, yeah? Indigenous people are not the furniture within that house, just to be moved around and put in whatever room you see fit. We're the foundations, the house is ours, it's our story. We have to live there. You can go away whenever you like. So that is what the guidelines are about, ultimate respect for people. And just quickly on VR as well, something that we're going to look at, going into VR is sold as virtual reality, So there is a whole new kind of voyeurism taking place, I feel, by non-Indigenous filmmakers making VR works about Indigenous people to give people an immersive experience. So it's certainly something that needs to be looked at, I think, in the future, because it's still edited and authored by a non-Indigenous person and sold as a reality. And so that's sort of something that we're addressing in our new update for protocols. The platform is very important, and collaboration, ultimate respect, and ultimately, this is a very elite industry. It costs a lot of money to make film and TV. If you're privileged enough to be in it, you really have to consider what stories you tell, how you tell them, and who you tell them to, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And also, people need to acknowledge that, what is your mindset when you walk walk into a project and you think, I'm the right person to tell this story about these people. It's a very privileged point of view, and people need to really question that. And, if they still feel like they're the one to do it, follow the guidelines, do it properly and collaborate, because you are telling stories that are going to be shared and accessible for many, many years to come. You're actually rewriting history, our history. We've always been written about. You're continuing to do that. And that really needs to be looked at and focused on.
Yeah, that's a good note. Now that's a good note to end on. And so as we're embarking on this journey now, 20, 30, 40 years too late, please keep in mind that this posting for the team and the project lead to do this is on the website, because we're hoping that by, I think it's January, we're going to begin to roll this out across the country. So stay tuned, and thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for sharing your experiences.
Thank you.